So have you ever slept for 8 hours and then woken up feeling as though you haven't slept at all? And you start to tell yourself, I just need an early night. But then I need a quiet weekend. And then maybe I desperately need a holiday, a vacation. But you sleep, you rest, you take some time off, and somehow you're still exhausted. Now, if that's happening to you, I want you to know something important. You may not simply need more sleep because there's a kind of exhaustion that sleep alone doesn't fix. And it can be one of the signs that you've moved beyond ordinary tiredness and into something deeper, burnout. But, and this is really important, burnout isn't the only thing that can cause it. So in this video, I want to show you how to start telling the difference. Because maybe you've been blaming yourself, why can't I get my energy back? Everyone else seems to cope. Why am I struggling to do things that I used to do without even thinking? And perhaps the most frightening one is, what's happening to me? So I'm Behrooz, I'm a public health doctor, and I've spent more than 20 years across medicine, studying at Harvard, working at the CDC, academia, and the NHS here in the UK. And yet I've burnt out more than once myself. So this isn't something that I've just been studying or doing research on. I've been living it for many years. And one of the things that I've learned is that there's a profound difference between being tired and being depleted. And also understanding that difference can completely change what you do next. So I learned this the hard way. During the pandemic in 2020, I was working in public health in the NHS here in the UK. And eventually I hit what I've previously described as a really hellish burnout. And my response made complete sense to me at the time. I reduced my workload and I eventually went to part-time working. Because surely if work was exhausting me, then less work would give me more energy. And there's a logic in that. Except I've subsequently learned something much more uncomfortable. We can reduce our hours, we can take time off, we can sleep longer, and still not address everything that's creating that exhaustion. In fact, I've burnt out again just recently in the last couple of months, and that forced me to question some of my own beliefs about recovery. And I had to admit, maybe I hadn't understood this as completely as I thought I had. And this is where the research becomes really interesting because ordinary tiredness and burnout exhaustion, they don't behave in quite the same way. So what I want to cover are 5 points that I've seen across the research as well as 3 questions. Now, here's the first distinction. Ordinary tiredness responds to recovery. So you've had a brutal week, you're shattered on, let's say, Friday, you sleep, and then have a quieter weekend, and gradually you start to feel like yourself again. But burnout can feel different. So rest may help temporarily, but the exhaustion persists or comes rushing back when you're exposed to the same demands again. There's actually a clinical concept used particularly in Sweden called exhaustion disorder. Now, don't get caught up in the medical terminology. The important point is that it describes prolonged physical and mental exhaustion that's associated with long-term stress. And one of the features can be something called unrefreshing sleep. And now that simply means exactly what it sounds like. You've slept, but you don't feel restored by that sleep. So imagine your energy like a phone battery. Ordinary tiredness is like a 10% battery. So you plug it in and you recharge it. Whereas burnout is more like plugging the phone in overnight and then waking up and looking at the screen and it's looking like it's still charged at 12%. So the problem isn't just that you haven't spent enough hours attached to the charger. That's why telling someone experiencing burnout to go just get some rest can completely miss the point. Because if chronic stress is continually draining the battery, then adding another hour in bed may not address what's draining it. But there's another clue that's arguably even more important than exhaustion. Think about the last few weeks. Are you simply feeling sleepy, or have you started losing access to the version of yourself that you used to rely on? Maybe you read the same paragraph 3 times. Maybe you walk into a room and forget why you're there. Maybe an email that should take you just a few minutes takes half an hour. You struggle to make decisions that used to feel effortless. And then something else happens. You start worrying about the worrying. Why can't I think anymore? Am I losing my edge? For a high achiever, whether you're a founder, a leader, a doctor, that can be terrifying because your ability to think, solve problems, care, and perform may be a huge part of your identity. So research into severe stress-related exhaustion describes problems with things like concentrating or memory and mental stamina, and what many people simply describe as brain fog. So the question isn't only, how tired am I? Instead ask, what is this exhaustion doing to my ability to think? And I'm actually going to explore burnout, brain fog much more deeply because there are some important things to understand about why your brain can suddenly feel as though it stopped working the way it used to. But before we get there, there's a third sign I find even more revealing because it isn't about energy at all. It's actually about caring. This is where burnout starts becoming emotionally painful. You may be someone who has always cared, a doctor who wanted to make things better, or a founder building something impactful, something that matters. Maybe a leader who feels responsible for their team, someone who wanted their work to mean something. That's very close to my own experience. And I've come to understand my burnout not simply through workload, but through caring deeply, wanting to create meaningful change, and then repeatedly encountering noise, waste, and barriers to doing that. So eventually something changes. You don't merely think, I'm tired. Instead, you start thinking, what's the point? You become irritated by things you once tolerated, perhaps more cynical, more detached, sometimes frighteningly numb. And you might look at work that you once loved and wonder, what happened to me? Now that change matters, and this is where something called ICD-11 helps us understand what burnout actually means. So ICD stands for the International Classification of Diseases. It's just a classification system produced by the World Health Organizations that health systems around the world use to describe not only diseases and health conditions, but also health-related problems. Now, the current version is called ICD-11, and importantly, it describes burnout specifically as an occupational phenomenon resulting from chronic workplace stress that hasn't been successfully managed. So in plain English, long-term work stress that has overwhelmed your ability to keep adapting to it. And it describes 3 dimensions. So first, it's exhaustion or feeling depleted of energy. Second, it's increasing mental distance from your work or becoming negative or cynical about it. And third, it's feeling less effective professionally. So burnout isn't simply, I'm really tired. It's more like, I'm exhausted, something has changed in how I feel about my work, and I'm no longer functioning in it like I used to. So that's why the change in your relationship with work can be such an important clue. Ordinary tiredness can leave the meaning of the work intact, whereas burnout can begin to change your relationship with the work itself. So now we have 3 clues. Rest isn't restoring you, your thinking has changed, and your relationship with your work may be changing. But here's the part I really don't want you to miss. If you've been exhausted for weeks or months, please don't watch a YouTube video or listen to a podcast, even one from a doctor, and diagnose yourself with burnout. Because persistent exhaustion is not specific to burnout, and that's important. There is considerable overlap between burnout, depression, and anxiety. And exhaustion by itself doesn't neatly tell us which somebody is experiencing. So for example, depression can cause profound exhaustion. And while burnout is specifically linked to work, depression may affect your enjoyment, mood, and sense of hope much more broadly across other aspects of life, not just work. Now, anxiety can cause exhaustion too. So can an underactive thyroid gland. Even iron deficiency and anemia can. Vitamin deficiencies can contribute. Sleep apnea, that's a condition where your breathing repeatedly stops or becomes disrupted while you're asleep, can leave you sleeping for hours and still waking up exhausted. And then there's long COVID, which can cause persistent fatigue. And then there's another condition called myalgic encephalomyelitis, or ME, or even CFS. That's also known as chronic fatigue syndrome, which can involve severe fatigue, unrefreshing sleep, cognitive problems, and something called post-exertional malaise. Now, that last term simply means that even relatively small amounts of physical or mental activity can cause a significant worsening of symptoms afterwards. And occasionally, other physical illnesses can present with persistent fatigue too. So if this exhaustion is persistent, unexplained, or worsening, or even affecting your ability to function, please do talk to a healthcare professional. They can look at the whole picture: your symptoms, your mood, your sleep, your medications, your health and medical history, and what's happening in your life and work. And depending on that entire picture, the clinical picture, they may decide that blood tests or other investigations are appropriate. So for example, a blood count can look for things like anemia. Thyroid blood tests can check whether your thyroid gland is working normally. And then depending on your symptoms, they might look at iron levels, vitamin deficiencies, or whether you could have a sleep disorder. And if you're experiencing things like unexplained weight loss or fever or a significant shortness of breath, swollen lymph nodes, or other new concerning symptoms, those deserve medical assessment rather than simply being labeled as stress. Now, because calling everything burnout can be just as unhelpful as calling burnout just tiredness, and once you've excluded or treated those other explanations, I think we come to perhaps the most important question in this video. What do you actually do if this is burnout-related exhaustion? So, sleep still matters, and I don't want you to hear this video as sleep is pointless. It absolutely isn't. Poor sleep and burnout can reinforce one another. But here's the distinction. Sleep is part of recovery. It isn't necessarily the whole solution. So if long-term stress is continually draining your system, endlessly trying to improve recovery without examining the source of that stress is like trying to fill a bath whilst leaving the plug out. And this is one of the places where my own thinking about burnout has changed. So after one burnout, I changed career. After another one, I went part-time. And then I became fascinated by the inside-out nature of our human experience. And by inside out, I simply mean recognizing that our experience isn't only created by what's happening around us. So how we think, how we relate to what's happening, and how connected we are to our own clarity and wisdom, they also shape how we experience life. So that became part of what I call natural genius. And I don't mean genius in the sense of being more intelligent and smart than everyone else. What I mean by genius is the well-being, the wisdom, the creativity and connection, the capability that is naturally available to us, but can become incredibly difficult to see when we're overwhelmed by stress, pressure, and noise. Now, my natural genius work has never been about trying to turn someone into a better performing version of themselves. The metaphor that I use is that we're not buying a better car or trying to repair a supposedly broken car. Instead, we're learning how the car already works and then how to use the natural capabilities that are built into it. But after burning out again, just in the last couple of months, I've had to revise something. So because sometimes inner work isn't enough either, there comes a point when wisdom might tell you something outside needs to change now. The workload, the boundaries, the role, the lack of autonomy, the environment, the expectations, perhaps even the work itself. And that's important because research into burnout interventions suggests that we shouldn't place the entire responsibility for recovery on the exhausted individual. So individual approaches can help. Things like mindfulness-based approaches, coaching, psychological support, cognitive behavioral approaches, and social support, they can all be helpful. But changes to working conditions matter too. So workload, protected time, how work is designed, managerial support. Because you can't always meditate your way out of a structurally unhealthy situation. Sometimes recovery asks us to look within. Sometimes it asks us to look around us. Often it's both. So if you've been watching this because you are exhausted right now, don't try to solve your entire life overnight. Start with 3 questions. Number 1, does rest restore you? Not perfectly, but after proper rest, how do you noticeably return towards yourself? Then number 2, has something else changed? Whether it's your concentration, memory, patience, sense of empathy, motivation, hope, maybe your relationship with work. And then finally, number 3, what keeps draining you? Not what's wrong with you, but ask, what's your exhaustion trying to tell you? Because that moves you from self-judgment to curiosity. And that's a much more useful place from which to make decisions. And if those questions are bringing things up for you, I've created something that can help explore them more deeply. It's called the Beyond Burnout Compass. It's a simple reflection tool. I've created it to help you step back and look at what's actually happening, not just at the exhaustion itself, but at the different parts of your work and life that may be contributing to it and where change may need to happen. So I've put the link in the description below if you'd like to use it. It's absolutely free. But don't use it as another task to complete. Don't try to get the right answers. Use it instead as a private space to get curious about what your exhaustion might be pointing towards, because the purpose isn't simply to become productive again. It's to begin to understand what needs your attention. Now, if you're the person lying in bed watching this, wondering how you can possibly be this exhausted after doing so little today, I want you to hear this. Your exhaustion deserves to be taken seriously. Don't immediately reduce it to laziness. Don't automatically call it burnout either. Get curious, get properly assessed if it's persistent. And if burnout is part of what's happening, don't measure recovery by how quickly you can force yourself back into your old level of productivity, because perhaps the goal isn't simply to get enough energy back to return to exactly the same life that depleted you. Perhaps the more interesting question is, what kind of life and work would allow that energy to come back and stay? Now there's another symptom that can be even more frightening than the exhaustion, because you can rest, but suddenly you realize that your brain doesn't seem to work the way it used to. You start to forget things, you can't concentrate, simple decisions suddenly feel ridiculously difficult. And if you're a high achiever, that can make you wonder whether you're somehow losing the person you used to be. So I've been looking closely at that and why that happens in burnout, and importantly, what it does and doesn't mean about your ability to recover. So do watch this next episode.